Imagine a world reduced to ash and radiation, where the old rules of civilization have crumbled into dust. In this savage wasteland, where survival means brutality and hope seems like a distant memory, one man dared to dream of empire. Not just any empire, but Rome itself, reborn from the nuclear fire. His name was Edward Sallow, but history would know him as Caesar, a scholar who became a conqueror, a teacher who became a tyrant, a man who erased 87 entire cultures from existence and built an army that made the wasteland tremble. But here's what haunts the Mojave to this day. Somewhere beneath the brilliant mind and iron will, beneath the Latin commands and Roman formations, there's a darker truth. Because Caesar didn't start as a monster, he started as one of the good guys, a member of the followers of the apocalypse, dedicated to healing the wasteland through knowledge and compassion. So what transforms a peaceful scholar into the most feared warlord in post-apocalyptic America? What makes a man who once taught literacy and medicine decide that the only path to peace is through absolute conquest and enslavement? The answer lies in a chance discovery, ancient texts found in the ruins of the Grand Canyon, and a choice that would doom or save the wasteland depending on who you ask. Tonight, we unravel the complete story of Caesar's legion, from a simple missionary expedition gone wrong to the bloodiest battle the Mojave has ever seen. A tale of philosophy and violence, of dialectics and decimation, of one man's vision to unite a broken world under the bull's banner, no matter the cost in human lives. So before we journey into the heart of Legion territory, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into Fallout lore. Drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what faction you choose in the wasteland. It's always amazing to see who's joining us from around the world. Now settle in, get comfortable, maybe grab some water for the journey ahead, and let's descend into the rise and fall of Caesar's legion together. Our story begins not with a conqueror, but with a child born into hope. The year was 2226, and Edward Sallow came into a world still struggling to recover from nuclear devastation. But unlike most wasteland children, Sallow wasn't born into a raider camp or a struggling settlement. He was born into the followers of the apocalypse, and that made all the difference. The followers of the apocalypse weren't warriors or merchants. They were dreamers, believers in humanity's potential to rise above the savage wasteland. Founded by former vault dwellers who emerged to find civilization destroyed, they dedicated themselves to a simple but radical mission: rebuild the world through knowledge, education, and compassion. No violence, no exploitation, just the patient work of teaching, healing, and hoping that humanity could learn from its mistakes. Young Edward Sallow absorbed everything the followers had to offer like a sponge soaking up water in the desert. While other children played in the ruins, Sallow studied ancient texts, pre-war histories, languages both living and dead. The teachers quickly realized they had something special on their hands. This wasn't just a bright student, this was a prodigy. By his teenage years, Sallow could speak multiple languages fluently. His photographic memory allowed him to recall entire books word for word. He devoured anthropology, linguistics, history, and philosophy, with an hunger that impressed even the most educated followers. But more than just absorbing knowledge, Sallow understood it. He could see patterns across cultures and centuries, connections that others missed. The followers had high hopes for young Edward. Here was someone who could take their mission to the next level, who could help bridge the gap between the old world's wisdom and the new world's needs. He became not just a student but a teacher himself, preparing for the day he could venture into the wasteland and share knowledge with those who needed it most. That day came in 2246, when Sallow was just 20 years old. The followers had been contacted by scouts who'd made contact with the Blackfoot tribe in the Arizona wasteland. Like many post-war tribes, the Blackfoot lived in a cycle of violence and scarcity. They raided neighbors for resources, lost young men to pointless conflicts, and had no written language or formal education system. They were, in the eyes of the followers, the perfect candidates for uplift. The mission seemed straightforward: travel to Blackfoot territory, teach them to read and write, share basic medical knowledge, and help them establish peaceful trade relationships with neighboring tribes. It was exactly the kind of work the followers existed to do, and Edward Sallow volunteered immediately. He wouldn't be going alone. The followers assigned 2 companions to the expedition. The first was Bill Calhoun, a fellow follower with medical training who could teach the Blackfoot basic healthcare and hygiene. The second was a man named Joshua Graham, and his presence was slightly unusual. Joshua Graham wasn't a follower, at least not originally. He'd been a Mormon missionary before the followers recruited him, a man who'd spent years wandering the dangerous wasteland spreading his faith. Graham had something the scholarly followers often lacked: practical survival skills and knowledge of combat. He could navigate hostile territory, negotiate with dangerous people, and if necessary, defend the expedition. He was insurance, a guardian for the idealistic scholars. The three men set out with high hopes and heavy packs full of books, medical supplies, and teaching materials. Sallow carried texts on agriculture, basic engineering, and conflict resolution. He had lesson plans for teaching literacy, ideas for helping the Blackfoot establish sustainable food sources, dreams of watching them transform from raiders to traders. The wasteland they traveled through was harsh but not unfamiliar. Post-nuclear Arizona was a landscape of dust and danger, where the sun beat down mercilessly by day and temperatures plunged at night. Scattered tribes fought over water sources and pre-war salvage. Radiation hotspots glowed in the darkness. Mutated creatures hunted in the ruins of the old world. But Sallow looked at this chaos and saw potential. Every tribe they passed was a future success story in his mind. Every act of violence was a problem that education could solve. Every cultural practice was data for his anthropological studies. He filled notebooks with observations, learned tribal dialects, and planned curricula tailored to each group's needs. When they finally reached Blackfoot territory, Sallow was optimistic. Yes, the Blackfoot had a reputation for aggression. Yes, they'd raided followers' caravans before. But surely once they understood the benefits of literacy, of medicine, of cooperation, they would embrace a better path. Surely knowledge could triumph over violence. The Blackfoot received them cautiously at first, but allowed the followers to set up a small camp on the edge of their territory. Sallow began his work immediately, gathering young Blackfoot and teaching them basic letters, demonstrating how written language could preserve knowledge across generations. Calhoun treated injuries and illnesses, showing them herbal remedies and basic sanitation. Graham helped with practical matters, using his wilderness skills to assist the tribe with hunting and defense. For weeks, it seemed to be working. Some Blackfoot showed genuine interest in learning. The tribal elders tolerated the strange outsiders and their foreign ideas. Sallow began to believe he was making real progress, that this would be the first of many successful interventions, that the followers' peaceful methods truly could heal the wasteland one tribe at a time. He had no idea that everything he believed was about to be shattered, that a single night of violence would transform him from teacher to tyrant, from scholar to warlord, from Edward Sallow, the follower of the apocalypse, into Caesar, the man who would make the wasteland kneel. The change was coming, and it would be written in blood. The attack came without warning in the dead of night. Sallow woke to screams and the smell of burning canvas. Blackfoot warriors, faces painted for war, were tearing through the followers' camp with brutal efficiency. These weren't the curious students who had sat in his lessons or the cautious elders who had tolerated their presence. These were raiders, and the peaceful coexistence had been nothing more than a convenient illusion. Bill Calhoun died first, cut down as he stumbled from his tent. The other followers scattered into the darkness. But the Blackfoot knew this terrain intimately. One by one, Sallow heard his colleagues fall silent. The screaming stopped. The night filled with the victorious war cries of the raiders and the crackling of flames consuming everything the expedition had brought. Edward Sallow and Joshua Graham survived, but not by luck. The Blackfoot had deliberately spared them, binding their hands with rough rope and dragging them back to the main tribal camp. As the sun rose over the Arizona wasteland, Sallow found himself kneeling in the dirt, surrounded by warriors who looked at him not as a teacher but as property. The next days revealed the harsh reality. The followers of the apocalypse had a policy, almost religious in its conviction. They did not negotiate with raiders. They did not pay ransoms. To do so would only encourage more violence, more kidnappings. It was a principled stand, born from genuine moral reasoning about not rewarding brutality. But it meant that Edward Sallow and Joshua Graham were on their own. The Blackfoot put them to work immediately. Slavery in the post-apocalyptic wasteland. wasn't the institutionalized system of the old world. It was cruder, more personal, more arbitrary. Sallow found himself hauling water, gathering firewood, performing whatever menial task his captors demanded. The brilliant scholar who had memorized entire libraries was reduced to a beast of burden. Yet even in captivity, Sallow's mind never stopped working. He observed everything. The Blackfoot weren't mindless savages. Despite what some Wastelanders believed, they had complex social structures, sophisticated oral traditions, tactical knowledge passed down through generations. But they were trapped in an endless cycle, and Sallow began to see the pattern clearly. The Blackfoot would raid a neighboring tribe, stealing supplies and taking captives. That tribe would retaliate, often with help from their allies. Blood feuds stretched back generations, kept alive by oral histories that turned every slight into a sacred duty of revenge. Young men died in pointless skirmishes over insults half remembered and grudges that no one could trace to their origin. Resources were scarce, so conflict was constant, but the conflict itself prevented any tribe from developing the stability needed to improve their situation. They couldn't establish farms because raiders would destroy them. They couldn't build permanent structures because they might need to flee. They couldn't innovate because all energy went into simple survival. Sallow had studied anthropology extensively. He recognized this pattern. These were the same dynamics that had trapped prehistoric peoples in cycles of tribal warfare, the same forces that had kept ancient societies fragmented and weak. And he knew from history that there was only one solution that had ever worked. Overwhelming force, total conquest, the complete subjugation of all rival powers under a single unified authority. It was during a work detail, carrying stones for some forgotten purpose, that Sallow made the discovery that would change the Wasteland forever. The Blackfoot had sent him into a canyon to retrieve materials from old ruins. Pre-war sites dotted the landscape, most picked clean long ago, but occasionally something remained in the deeper, more dangerous locations. This particular ruin was buried in the Grand Canyon's depths, accessible only by treacherous climbing. The Blackfoot warriors watched from above, unwilling to risk the descent themselves, as Sallow picked his way down ancient paths. What he found in a collapsed building, preserved by some quirk of the nuclear aftermath, was a cache of books. Not the scientific manuals or medical texts the followers had carried, not the dry technical documents of the old world. These were histories, military treatises, philosophical works from ancient Rome, and among them, pristine and readable despite 2 centuries of apocalypse, was Commentari de Bello Gallico, Caesar's Gallic Wars. Sallow had read about this text in follower libraries, but he'd never held an actual copy. Now, sitting in the ruins of the old world, he devoured it with desperate intensity. Julius Caesar's account of conquering Gaul wasn't just military history, it was a blueprint. The ancient Gauls had been fierce warriors, divided into dozens of tribes, each with their own customs and constant feuds. They had been, in many ways, exactly like the Wasteland tribes. Brave, resourceful, and completely incapable of unifying against external threats. Caesar had exploited every division, played tribes against each other, and ultimately conquered them all by offering something they couldn't create themselves. Order, unity, peace through absolute submission to Roman authority. Night after night, Sallow read by firelight, while his captors slept. He found other works in that cache: Polybius on military tactics, Thucydides on power politics, Marcus Aurelius on the philosophy of empire. Each book reinforced the same lesson: democracy, negotiation, peaceful coexistence. These were luxuries that required stability. You couldn't build stability through kindness in a world of violence. You built it through strength. The followers had been wrong, fundamentally, completely wrong. Education couldn't save people who might be killed tomorrow. Medicine meant nothing if raiders burned your village. Trade required security that tribes locked in blood feuds could never establish. The Wasteland didn't need teachers. It needed a conqueror. Joshua Graham noticed the change in Sallow before anyone else. The former Mormon had his own crisis of faith during their captivity, but he recognized something shifting in his companion. Sallow began speaking differently, carrying himself differently. He started teaching select Blackfoot warriors, not reading and writing, but tactics, Roman tactics. the wedge formation for breaking enemy lines, the testudo for defense against projectiles, the importance of unit cohesion over individual bravery. He taught them Latin commands because unified language meant unified action. He introduced the concept of decimation, killing every 10th man in a unit that showed cowardice, because fear of failure had to exceed fear of the enemy. And slowly, incredibly, it worked. The Blackfoot who followed Sallow's methods won their skirmishes. They took fewer casualties. They captured more resources. Other warriors took notice. Tribal elders, always pragmatic about survival, gave the strange slave more authority. Within months, Sallow had effectively become a military advisor to the very people who had enslaved him. But he wasn't Edward Sallow anymore, not in his own mind. He had taken a new name from his books, from the general who had transformed a republic into an empire, who had conquered Gaul and crossed the Rubicon, who had shown that one man with vision and will could reshape the world. He was Caesar now. And the Blackfoot tribe was about to become the foundation of something the Wasteland had never seen. Not a tribe, not a nation, but a legion, an army that would sweep across the desert like their Roman predecessors had swept across Europe, erasing every tribal boundary, crushing every resistance, offering only two choices: submit or die. The transformation from captive to commander was nearly complete. All that remained was the first conquest, the first proof that ancient methods could dominate the modern wasteland. Caesar had his strategy, his soldiers, his vision of a new world order built on the ashes of tribal chaos. The followers of the apocalypse had sent a teacher to enlighten the wasteland. They had created a monster instead. The first test of Caesar's methods came swiftly, and it would set the pattern for everything that followed. A rival tribe, the Ridgers, had been raiding Blackfoot territory for months. The traditional response would have been a revenge raid. Young warriors charging in for glory, taking some casualties, maybe capturing a few enemies, and perpetuating the cycle. Caesar had a different approach entirely. He spent 2 weeks studying the Ridgers, not just their camp location, but their patterns, their weaknesses, their internal politics. He sent scouts to observe their daily routines. He identified their best warriors, their leaders, their supply caches. He learned which families held grudges against their own chiefs, which young men felt overlooked for honors. Then he struck with overwhelming force at dawn, using tactics the Ridgers had never encountered. The Blackfoot warriors moved in perfect formation, shields locked, advancing like a machine rather than a mob. They didn't charge recklessly. They didn't break ranks for individual combat. They simply advanced, step by disciplined step, cutting down anyone who resisted. The Ridger warriors fought bravely, but bravery meant nothing against method. Their individual skill couldn't overcome coordinated tactics. Within hours, their resistance collapsed. But Caesar's real innovation came next, in what he did with victory. Traditional tribal warfare had rules, unspoken but understood. You killed the warriors, took the valuables, maybe captured some slaves and left. Tribes could recover, rebuild, and the cycle continued. Caesar rejected this entirely. He didn't just defeat the Ridgers, he erased them. Every fighting-age male was given a choice: swear absolute loyalty to Caesar, abandon every aspect of Ridger identity, and join the legion, or die. There was no middle ground, no negotiation, no honor in defiant last stands. Submit completely, or face extinction. Most chose life, though it meant betraying everything they'd known. Those who refused were executed publicly, crucified along the roads as warnings. The women and children were enslaved, put to work supporting the growing legion. The Ridger language was forbidden, their customs were outlawed, their history was declared dead. Within a month, the Ridgers didn't exist anymore. There were only legionaries who happened to have been born in Ridger camps, who now spoke Latin, followed Roman discipline, and knew no loyalty except to Caesar. Joshua Graham watched this transformation with complex feelings. The former missionary had his own history of violence justified by faith, his own experience with absolute conviction in a cause. He understood what Caesar was building, even if part of him recoiled from the brutality. And crucially, Graham had the military experience that Caesar lacked. The scholar knew Roman tactics from books. Graham knew how to actually fight. Together they forged something terrifying. Caesar provided the vision, the strategy, the grand design. Graham provided the practical knowledge of warfare, the ability to turn theory into bloody reality. Caesar named him legate, the first of what would become the legion's highest military rank. Malpais legate, they called him, after the Badlands where he'd once preached. The burned man, some whispered, though that name wouldn't gain its full significance until years later. The conquest accelerated. The Kaibab tribe saw what happened to the ridges and surrendered without a fight, calculating that submission beat extinction. Caesar accepted, but the terms were identical: total cultural erasure, complete absorption into the legion. Within the year, 7 tribes had fallen. By 2250, 15 more had been conquered or absorbed. Caesar's system was brutally efficient. Scouts identified targets. Frumentari, named after Roman grain collectors who'd also served as spies, infiltrated enemy camps, spreading rumors and identifying weaknesses. When the legion attacked, it came with overwhelming numbers and perfect discipline. Resistance was crushed. Survivors were assimilated. The machine grew stronger with each victory. But the military success was only half of Caesar's vision. He was building something larger than an army. He was constructing a civilization, twisted as it might be based on absolute principles. Latin became the official language, not just for commands but for everything. Tribal dialects were stamped out ruthlessly. Children were separated from parents and raised in legion camps, taught Latin before they could remember their birth tongue. Within a generation, dozens of unique languages would be extinct, replaced by Caesar's imposed unity. Women had no place in combat, no political voice, no independence. Caesar's interpretation of Roman society was selective and extreme. Women existed to support the legion through labor and childbirth. Nothing more. It was efficient, he argued, dedicating half the population to support while the other half focused purely on conquest. It was also monstrous, reducing human beings to functions in his grand design. The legion's structure became more elaborate as it grew. At the bottom were the recruit legionaries, new conscripts proving their loyalty. Above them, prime legionaries, experienced fighters. Squads of 8 formed a contubinium, led by a decanus. 10 such units made a century, commanded by a centurion. The hierarchy was rigid, punishment severe, and advancement based purely on demonstrated loyalty and combat effectiveness. Decimation became a regular punishment. When a unit failed, showed cowardice, or broke discipline, every 10th man was beaten to death by his comrades. It was Roman, Caesar explained, citing historical precedent. It was also psychologically devastating, binding survivors together through shared trauma and guilt, making failure more terrifying than death. The Praetorian Guard formed around Caesar himself, the absolute elite, warriors who had proven their fanatical loyalty through countless battles. They were better equipped than regular legionaries, though equipment was always crude by Wasteland standards. Caesar rejected advanced technology, arguing it made men weak and dependent. Machetes and spears, simple firearms, leather and metal armor, nothing that required complex maintenance or couldn't be produced through slave labor. By 2255, 30 tribes had ceased to exist, their populations absorbed into the growing legion. The eastern Arizona wasteland, once a patchwork of competing cultures, was unified under the bull banner. Raiders who had once terrorized trade routes now enforced Caesar's peace. Tribes that had warred for generations now marched in lockstep formation. But success brought new challenges. An army requires supplies, and the legion's rejection of advanced technology meant they couldn't manufacture much. They scavenged and conquered, taking what they needed from each defeated enemy. But that only worked while there were enemies to defeat, resources to plunder. What happened when the conquests ended? Caesar had an answer, drawn from his Roman histories. Rome hadn't stopped at Italy. The Republic had expanded relentlessly, each conquest funding the next, each victory demanding another. The legion would do the same. They would never stop, could never stop. Permanent war was the price of the peace they brought. And there were still so many tribes to conquer. The Great Plains stretched northward, populated by dozens of groups. Colorado held fierce mountain tribes like the Hydebarks. New Mexico's deserts concealed scattered settlements. The conquest had barely begun, but Caesar was already thinking bigger. His scouts brought reports of something unprecedented to the west. Not tribes, but a nation. The new California Republic, a democracy with hundreds of thousands of citizens, professional armies, functioning government. Everything the Legion opposed, everything Caesar's philosophy rejected. Perfect. Rome had needed Carthage, had needed Gaul, had needed worthy enemies to define itself against. The Legion had found its Gaul. The NCR would serve as the anvil against which Caesar would forge his empire. But first, the Legion needed to grow stronger, needed to conquer more, needed to become inevitable. 57 tribes had fallen by 2260, 70 by 2265. The number climbed relentlessly. Each conquest added soldiers, slaves, resources. Each victory proved Caesar's method superior. The Wasteland was learning a harsh lesson. Divided, the tribes were weak. United under Caesar's absolute authority, they were unstoppable. The choice facing every group was simple: join the Legion willingly and retain some dignity, or resist and be destroyed utterly. Most chose survival, however bitter. Some chose defiance and died. And the Legion grew and grew and grew. By 2260, Caesar controlled territory larger than many pre-war states. But calling it an empire would be generous. It was more accurately described as a mobile war machine, constantly in motion, feeding on conquest because it had no other sustainable economic model. The Legion had become terrifyingly effective at what it did. Scouts moved ahead of the main force, sometimes months in advance, learning everything about potential targets. The Frumentari network had evolved into something sophisticated, with agents living among enemy tribes for years, rising to positions of trust, waiting for the signal to strike from within. When that signal came, the results were predictable. A tribe that seemed strong would suddenly fracture from internal betrayal. Leaders would be assassinated at crucial moments. Supply caches would mysteriously burn. And then the Legion would arrive, not as raiders but as an army, organized and overwhelming. The Hydebarks tribe in the Colorado mountains thought their terrain would protect them. The narrow passes, the high altitude, the defensive positions they'd held for generations. Caesar sent the Legion anyway, and what followed was a masterclass in sustained brutality. The campaign took months, fighting through mountain passes in winter, taking horrific casualties but never wavering. When the Hydebarks finally broke, Caesar made an example of them. Every survivor was enslaved, their mountain strongholds burned, their very name cursed. It sent a message across the wasteland. Geography wouldn't save you. Defiance had a price. But beneath the surface of military triumph, cracks were forming in Caesar's grand design. The Legion excelled at conquest, but struggled with everything that came after. They had no real economy beyond plunder and slavery. No manufacturing capability beyond what their slaves could produce. No innovation, no research, no development of new techniques or technologies. Caesar justified this through philosophy. Technology, he argued, made people weak and dependent. The old world had created marvels of science and destroyed itself with nuclear fire. The Legion would be different, relying on discipline, training, human will, but this left them perpetually scavenging, dependent on finding pre-war equipment they couldn't replace or repair. Medical care was another critical weakness. The Legion had no trained doctors, no understanding of surgery or disease beyond basic field medicine. Injuries that could be easily treated in NCR territory often proved fatal in Legion camps. Caesar himself had begun experiencing headaches, occasional dizzy spells that he attributed to stress and ignored. The brain tumor growing in his skull would remain undiagnosed for years. Then there was the question of culture, or rather, the complete absence of it. Caesar had systematically destroyed 87 distinct cultures, each with their own stories, songs, traditions, and knowledge. In their place, he'd created nothing but military discipline and Latin commands. The Legion had no art, no music, no literature beyond what Caesar allowed. It was a civilization defined entirely by what it destroyed, not what it created. Women bore the worst of this cultural void, reduced to property, forbidden from combat or political participation. They existed in a state of permanent subjugation. Some Legion apologists argued this freed men for warfare, that it was a practical adaptation to wasteland conditions. In reality, it was slavery, pure and simple, half the population treated as breeding stock and labor. The enslaved populations from conquered tribes lived in constant fear. A legion slave's life expectancy was brutally short. They could be worked to death, killed for minor infractions, or simply disposed of when they were no longer useful. There was no path to freedom, no hope of redemption. You served until you died, and if you tried to escape, crucifixion awaited. Yet the system worked, in its horrific way. Fear kept the slaves compliant. Constant warfare kept the legionaries focused. Absolute hierarchy prevented internal power struggles. And at the center of it all stood Caesar, the mind behind the machine, the philosopher king, whose word was literally law. Caesar had become more than a military commander. He'd achieved something approaching divinity in his followers' eyes. Legionaries believed he was chosen by Mars, the god of war. They believed he was invincible, that his cause was righteous, that serving him was the highest purpose a man could achieve. When Caesar spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute truth. This cult of personality was both the legion's greatest strength and its most critical vulnerability. Every decision flowed from Caesar. Every strategy originated in his mind. The entire structure depended on his continued leadership. But Caesar was human, mortal, and the headaches were getting worse. By 2270, the legion's expansion had slowed, not from resistance but from simple geography. They controlled Arizona and New Mexico, had pushed deep into Colorado, claimed portions of Utah and Nevada, but they'd conquered most of the major tribes in their operational range. The easy pickings were gone. Caesar knew this was a crisis point. Historically, empires that stopped expanding often collapsed. The legions needed war, needed conquest, needed external enemies to maintain internal cohesion. If the fighting stopped, if the legionaries had time to think, to question, to remember what they'd lost, the whole structure might fracture. He needed something bigger, not another tribe, but a genuine civilization to fight, something that could serve as the legion's defining enemy, the way Carthage had defined Rome, the way Gaul had given Caesar his name and glory. The new California Republic wasn't just another enemy, it was everything the legion opposed, a living argument against Caesar's entire philosophy. The NCR proved that democracy could work in the wasteland, that people could govern themselves without a tyrant. They had functioning courts, elected officials, property rights, individual freedom. They were weak in many ways, corrupt and bureaucratic, but they were building something that might actually last. Caesar's scouts brought detailed reports. The NCR had expanded eastward to the Colorado River. They discovered Hoover Dam, a pre-war marvel that still generated massive amounts of electricity. They'd established military bases, brought in settlers, started talking about annexing the Mojave Wasteland. And they'd found New Vegas, the city of lights that had somehow survived the nuclear holocaust. 3 casinos still operated on the Strip, powered by Hoover Dam, controlled by a mysterious figure called Mr. House. The NCR wanted it. They'd gone to war with the local Brotherhood of Steel chapter to secure the region. They were bringing their version of civilization to the desert. Caesar saw it all clearly now. His dialectic, his grand theory of history based on Hegelian philosophy. The legion was the thesis, a return to ancient values of strength and order. The NCR was the antithesis, clinging to the failed democracy that had destroyed the old world. When they clashed, really clashed, the result would be synthesis. Something new, something better forged from the conflict. And New Vegas would be the crucible, not just a prize to be won, but the site where history would pivot. Caesar's Rome, the eternal city rising from the ruins. But to claim it, to fulfill his destiny, he needed to defeat the NCR decisively. He needed Hoover Dam. The Frumentarii began their work immediately. Agents infiltrated the Mojave, posed as traders and travelers, gathered intelligence on NCR positions and strength. They learned about the Rangers, elite troops in salvaged power armor. They discovered supply line vulnerabilities, political tensions, the fact that many NCR citizens opposed the aggressive expansion. But they also learned the NCR was formidable, well-equipped, well-trained, backed by an industrial base that could replace losses. This wouldn't be like fighting tribes. This would be total war between genuine military powers. Caesar didn't care. In fact, he welcomed it. Easy victories had served their purpose. Now he needed a challenge worthy of his legion, an enemy that would force them to become truly great. NCR would be his goal, and he would be Caesar crossing the Rubicon. By 2277, preparations were complete. The legion's full strength, accumulated through decades of conquest, would march on Hoover Dam. Joshua Graham, the Malpais Lego, would command. Every tactical advantage had been identified, every possible contingency planned for. Caesar was certain of victory. After all, the legion had never lost a major engagement. They were inevitable, unstoppable, destiny made manifest. He had no idea that Hubris, not the NCR, would be his greatest enemy, that the first battle of Hoover Dam would shatter everything he believed, and set in motion events that would determine not just the legion's fate, but the future of the entire wasteland. The army began its march westward, thousands of legionaries, moving in perfect formation, singing war songs in Latin, utterly convinced of their superiority. They were marching toward disaster. The assault on Hoover Dam began at dawn on a day that would live in infamy for the legion. Caesar watched from Fortification Hill as thousands of his legionaries crossed the Colorado River, a human tide flowing toward the massive concrete structure that represented everything he'd been working toward. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: overwhelm the NCR through sheer numbers and discipline, break their lines through relentless pressure, take the dam and hold it against any counterattack. Joshua Graham led from the front, the Malpais legate in his element. His tactical brilliance had never failed Caesar before. The legion moved in coordinated waves, exactly as drilled. Recruit legionaries went first, expendable troops meant to exhaust NCR ammunition and identify defensive positions. Behind them came the prime legionaries, the veterans who would exploit any weakness. The centurions directed their units with precision, and for the first hours everything went according to plan. The NCR positions on the eastern approach crumbled under the assault. Legionaries swarmed over sandbag fortifications, cutting down defenders with machetes and throwing spears. The dam's roadway became a killing ground as both sides fought for every inch of concrete. Bodies fell into the river below. The water ran red. But then the legion encountered something they hadn't truly prepared for: the NCR Rangers. These weren't the regular army troops that the legion had been pushing back. These were elite soldiers, many wearing salvaged power armor from the Brotherhood War. They held defensive positions with a discipline that matched the legion's own, and they had something the legion lacked: superior firepower. Sniper rifles cracked from concealed positions. NCR 1st Recon sharpshooters began systematically eliminating centurions, decapitating the legion's command structure. Each shot was precise, calculated, devastating. A centurion would fall, and his century would falter, the rigid hierarchy becoming a liability when leaders were picked off one by one. Chief Hanlon, the legendary NCR Ranger, had studied the legion's tactics. He understood their strength came from discipline and coordination, so he targeted the coordinators. Every officer became a priority target. The legion's advantage began to erode. Still, the sheer weight of numbers kept pushing forward. Graham led a massive assault onto the dam itself, fighting in brutal close quarters where the legion's melee weapons gave them an advantage. For a moment, victory seemed possible. The NCR line was bending, perhaps about to break. Then came Boulder City. The NCR had fortified the town on the western side of the dam, and when the legion pushed too far, too fast, they fell into a trap that would become legendary. NCR forces retreated into Boulder City in apparent disarray, and Graham, sensing a complete rout, ordered his best troops to pursue. The Malpais legate himself led the charge into the town, certain he was about to crush the NCR's last resistance. The entire town had been rigged with explosives. Buildings that looked like defensive positions were actually death traps. Underground charges had been placed throughout the city, and when the legion's forces were deep inside, concentrated in narrow streets, the NCR detonated everything at once. The explosion was visible from Fortification Hill. Caesar saw it, felt it, watched helplessly as a mushroom cloud of dust and debris rose from Boulder City. When it cleared, hundreds of his best legionaries were dead or dying, buried under collapsed buildings, trapped in the rubble. The Malpais legate's forces were shattered. But Graham himself survived the blast, pulling himself from the wreckage, bloodied but still fighting. He rallied what remained of his troops for a retreat, trying to salvage something from the disaster. The legion fell back across the dam, harassed every step by NCR forces who now smelled victory. The battle that was supposed to give Caesar his Rome had become a catastrophic defeat. Over 1,000 legionaries lay dead. The survivors retreated across the Colorado River in disarray, the first time in the legion's history that they'd been forced to withdraw from a major engagement. The myth of invincibility, carefully cultivated over decades, shattered in a single day. Caesar's reaction was immediate and terrible. Someone had to pay for this failure, and it couldn't be Caesar himself. His philosophy, his strategy, his grand vision, none of that could be questioned. So the blame fell entirely on Joshua Graham. The Malpais legate was summoned to Fortification Hill. Graham came willingly, ready to accept responsibility, still loyal despite everything. He'd failed his commander, failed the legion, failed the cause he'd devoted his life to. But he had no idea of the punishment that awaited. Caesar's judgment was public, theatrical, designed to send a message to every legionary. Failure, no matter the circumstance, no matter the past loyalty, would not be tolerated. The cult of personality demanded a scapegoat, and Graham would serve that purpose. They covered him in pitch, the sticky black substance coating his body from head to toe. Graham stood silent, accepting his fate with the stoicism he'd maintained throughout his life. Then they set him ablaze. The Malpais legate burned. The screams echoed across Fortification Hill as Joshua Graham, Caesar's most trusted commander, his partner in building the legion from nothing, was consumed by fire. And when the flames had done their work, when Graham's body was a charred, smoking ruin, they threw him into the Grand Canyon. The same canyon where Caesar had found his inspiration, where the books that started everything had been discovered, now became Graham's grave, or so everyone believed. In reality, Joshua Graham would survive, crawling from the canyon depths despite burns covering most of his body, to become the legend of the burned man. But the Legion didn't know that. They thought their legend didn't know that. They thought their legend was dead, a sacrifice to Caesar's rage and the need to maintain absolute authority. The message was clear. Even the highest-ranking officer, even someone who'd been instrumental in creating the Legion, could be cast aside if they failed. It bound the remaining legionaries closer to Caesar through fear, made them terrified of disappointing their leader. But it also revealed the fundamental weakness in Caesar's system. Everything depended on him. His judgment, his decisions, his continued leadership, and those headaches that had been plaguing him were getting worse. The tumor in his brain was growing, affecting his thinking in ways he couldn't even recognize. The very structure of the Legion, built on absolute loyalty to one man, contained the seeds of its own destruction. In the aftermath of Hoover Dam, Caesar promoted a new legate, Laenius, the monster of the East, a warrior of unmatched brutality who'd carved a bloody path through Colorado's tribes. Unlike Graham, who'd been a missionary before becoming a soldier, Laenius was pure violence. He had no philosophy, no nuance, just an absolute commitment to conquest through terror. The Legion licked its wounds and retreated to Arizona. 4 years would pass before they were ready to try again. 4 years of rebuilding, retraining, and replanning. Caesar studied what had gone wrong, though he could never quite admit that his own overconfidence had been the real problem. Instead, he focused on tactical adjustments, better intelligence, more careful preparation. The Frumentari network expanded dramatically. Agents flooded into the Mojave, gathering information, sowing chaos, preparing the ground for the next assault. Nipton would be destroyed as a warning. Camp Searchlight would be irradiated. NCR positions would be harassed constantly, keeping them off balance. And Caesar's health continued to deteriorate. The headaches became migraines, the dizzy spells more frequent. He had blackouts that he tried to hide from his followers, moments where his mind simply went blank. The brain tumor was killing him slowly, and without proper medical care there was nothing that could be done. But Caesar couldn't show weakness. He was a god to his followers, chosen by Mars, destined to rebuild civilization. Admitting mortality would undermine everything. So he pushed forward, planning for the second assault on Hoover Dam, determined to achieve his dialectic synthesis before his body betrayed him completely. By 2281, the stage was set for the final confrontation. The legion was stronger, better prepared, and led by Lanius's brutal efficiency. The NCR was weaker, overextended, and plagued by political problems back home. Everything favored the legion this time, except for one factor that no one could have predicted. A courier shot in the head and left for dead in a shallow grave was about to wake up and change everything. One person with no allegiance to any faction would become the variable that determined the Wasteland's future. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam was approaching, and this time the outcome wouldn't be decided by armies alone. The year 2281 brought Caesar closer to his goal than ever before, but also closer to death. The brain tumor had progressed to the point where it could no longer be ignored. Caesar experienced seizures, moments where his body betrayed him completely, his vision blurred at critical moments. His legendary intellect, the mind that had built an empire from nothing, was being eaten away from the inside, and still he refused proper medical treatment, clinging to his rejection of advanced technology even as it killed him. But fate, or perhaps the Wasteland's dark sense of irony, provided an opportunity. A follower of the apocalypse named Arcade Gannon had entered the Mojave, and with the right persuasion, he could be convinced to perform surgery on Caesar. The same organization that had created Caesar through education might now save his life through medicine. The symmetry was almost poetic. Yet the decision tormented Caesar. Accepting help meant admitting weakness, relying on the very technology and expertise he'd spent decades condemning. His philosophy demanded that he refuse, that he face death with stoic acceptance. But his ambition, his need to see his vision fulfilled, argued otherwise. The dialectic couldn't achieve synthesis if he died before the crucial battle. Meanwhile, the Mojave had become a powder keg waiting for a spark. The Legion controlled the eastern bank of the Colorado River, with forward bases at Cottonwood Cove and the fort at Fortification Hill. They'd secured Nelson, crucifying NCR soldiers along the roads as psychological warfare. Vulpes in Coulter's Frumentari had turned Nipton into a monument of terror, the town's population decimated in a lottery of death. The NCR held the dam and the western Mojave, but barely. Camp McCarran served as their main base, but it was plagued by internal problems. Fiends attacked constantly from the north. The Kings caused trouble in Freeside. NCR morale was low, supply lines stretched thin, and President Kimball faced intense political pressure back in California to either win decisively or withdraw entirely. And then there was the wild card nobody had fully accounted for, the Courier. Shot in the head by Benny, the chairman of the Tops Casino, and left in a shallow grave in Goodsprings Cemetery, the Courier had somehow survived. A robot named Victor had dug them up, and Doc Mitchell had patched them back together. Now they wandered the Mojave, initially just trying to find the man who'd tried to kill them and recover the platinum chip he'd stolen. But the Courier's actions rippled across the Wasteland in ways no one could predict. Every choice they made, every faction they helped or hindered, shifted the balance of power. They were the embodiment of individual agency in a world where Caesar believed only historical forces mattered. Caesar learned of the Courier through his Frumentari network. At first they seemed insignificant, just another Wasteland wanderer, but reports kept coming. The Courier had destroyed the Powder Gangers or allied with them. They'd resolved the situation in Preem. They dealt with the Great Khans, either destroying them, befriending them, or turning them against the NCR. Every action had consequences, and those consequences were adding up. Most intriguingly, the Courier had the platinum chip, the pre-war artifact that Mr. House desperately wanted. That chip was the key to upgrading House's Securitron army, transforming them from a minor threat into a major military force. Whoever controlled the Courier might control the chip, and whoever controlled the chip might control New Vegas itself. Caesar made a calculated decision. He invited the Courier to the fort to meet him face to face. It was a risk, bringing a potential enemy into his headquarters, but Caesar believed in his ability to persuade, to convert through philosophy rather than force. He would explain the dialectic, show the Courier why the Legion's victory was historically necessary, perhaps even convince them to help destroy Mr. House's bunker and eliminate that variable from the equation. Some paths led to the Courier agreeing, seeing merit in Caesar's arguments or simply calculating that the Legion would win regardless. They might retrieve the platinum chip and destroy House's army before it could be upgraded. They might secure alliances with the Boomers at Nellis Air Force Base, with the Great Khans, with other Mojave factions, all in service of the Legion's conquest. Other paths led to confrontation. The Courier might reject everything Caesar stood for, might work actively to ensure his defeat. They could strengthen the NCR's position, upgrade House's Securitrons, or even claim the chip for themselves and forge an independent New Vegas free from both armies. But regardless of the Courier's choices, the Second Battle of Hoover Dam was inevitable. Too much had been invested, too many forces committed. Caesar's entire philosophy demanded this confrontation. The Legion had spent 4 years preparing, and Legate Laenius had assembled the largest army the Wasteland had seen since before the bombs fell. The assault plan was more sophisticated than the first battle. Multiple strike points, better intelligence, contingencies for NCR tactics. Laenius would lead the main assault on the dam while diversionary attacks hit Camp McCarran and other NCR positions. Frumentarii would activate sleeper agents throughout the Mojave. The Omertas, one of the families controlling the Vegas casinos, had been cultivated as potential allies, ready to strike at House or the NCR from within. President Kimball visited Hoover Dam to boost morale, presenting another opportunity. Volp's Inculter orchestrated assassination attempts, multiple contingencies to kill the NCR leader and throw their government into chaos. If Kimball died, the NCR's political will to continue the Mojave campaign might collapse entirely. And through it all, Caesar's health deteriorated. If he'd accepted surgery, he might survive, might live to see his vision fulfilled. If he'd refused, he might die during the battle, leaving Laenius to lead the Legion into an uncertain future. Either way, the outcome would depend on factors beyond his control. A bitter irony for a man who'd built his entire philosophy on controlling historical forces. The battle itself unfolded across multiple fronts. At Hoover Dam, Laenius led the assault with terrifying efficiency. The monster of the East lived up to his reputation, cutting through NCR defenders with brutal skill. Legion forces pushed onto the dam, fighting with fanatic determination. This time, they were ready for NCR tactics, adapted to counter Ranger snipers, prepared for the kind of trap that had destroyed them at Boulder City. But variables kept emerging, factors that no amount of planning could fully account for. Had the Courier helped the Boomers, then artillery might rain down on Legion positions, massive shells that even the most disciplined formation couldn't withstand. Had they upgraded the Securitrons, then House's army might intervene, a third force that neither Legion nor NCR had prepared for. Had the Courier convinced the Great Khans to abandon the Legion, then a crucial ally would be missing, perhaps even fighting against Caesar's forces. Had they strengthened NCR positions, retrieved weapons from hidden caches, rallied the Mojave factions, each possibility created different outcomes, different futures. The fighting was brutal beyond measure. The dam's roadway became slick with blood. Bodies fell into the Colorado River, swept away by currents that had flowed long before the war and would flow long after. Legionaries and NCR troops died by the hundreds, by the thousands, all for control of a concrete structure and the power it represented. In some timelines, Laenius reached the legate's camp at the western end of the dam, the final NCR stronghold. There he might face the Courier directly, a confrontation that would determine everything. Could they convince him that victory was hollow, that even if the Legion took the dam, they couldn't hold it against the full might of the NCR? Could they persuade the monster of the East to retreat, to preserve Legion lives for future battles? Or would Laenius refuse all argument, seeing only the glory of conquest, the necessity of victory regardless of cost? Would he fight to the death, taking as many enemies with him as possible, a warrior's end for a warrior's life? In other timelines, the Legion won decisively, overwhelming NCR defenses through sheer numbers and tactical superiority. The dam fell, NCR forces routed, and Caesar's dream of New Rome seemed within reach. The Mojave would be pacified under Legion authority, slavery and order spreading across the wasteland. In still others, the NCR held, beating back the assault through determination and superior firepower. The Legion would break against their defenses like waves against a cliff, forced to retreat once more, perhaps never to return. Democracy, flawed as it was, would endure in the Mojave. And in the strangest timelines, neither faction won. The Courier, having accumulated enough power, enough alliances, enough raw determination, would drive both armies from the Mojave. House's Securitrons, or an independent force, would secure the dam, establishing New Vegas as a city-state beholden to no one. The dialectic that Caesar had envisioned would be rejected entirely, replaced by something he'd never anticipated. Individual choice, not historical forces, would determine the future. Whatever the outcome, the Second Battle of Hoover Dam marked the end of an era. Caesar's legion, whether victorious or defeated, would never be the same. The Mojave would never be the same, and the Wasteland would learn once again the oldest lesson of all. War never changes, but the people who fight it do. When the dust settled over Hoover Dam, when the last shots were fired and the final bodies fell, the Wasteland counted its dead and wondered what it had gained. The Legion's fate hung entirely on the outcome of that single battle. Victory or defeat, the ramifications would echo across the Wasteland for generations. And more than any strategic calculation or tactical brilliance, it all came down to choices made by individuals, the very thing Caesar had dismissed as irrelevant to the grand sweep of history. If the Legion had triumphed, if Lanius had broken through NCR defenses and claimed the dam, then Caesar's vision took one step closer to reality. The Mojave would fall under Legion control with all the horror that entailed. Settlements across the Wasteland would face the same choice that 87 tribes before them had faced: submit completely or be destroyed utterly. Freeside, that collection of desperate people living in Vegas's shadow, would be swept clean. The NCR squatters would be crucified. The locals would be enslaved or conscripted. The Kings, that gang that styled themselves after pre-war Elvis impersonators, would cease to exist. Their culture, their identity, their very memory would be erased in favor of Legion unity. Westside's community farm would be seized, its cooperative structure destroyed in favor of slave labor. The followers of the apocalypse, still trying to help people through medicine and education, would be driven out or killed. The irony wouldn't be lost on anyone who knew the Legion's origins. Caesar, created by the followers, would destroy them utterly. New Vegas itself would transform. The casinos would operate under Legion oversight, generating revenue for Caesar's empire but stripped of their independence. Mr. House, if he still lived, would be gone, his vision of technological progress rejected. The three families, the Omerators, White Gloves, and Chairmen, would serve new masters or disappear entirely, and the slavery would be total. Every person in the Mojave who couldn't fight would be pressed into service. Women would face the worst of it, reduced to breeding stock and labor, their lives measured purely by their utility to the Legion. Children would be taken from parents and raised as legionaries, taught to worship Caesar and Mars, their original identities burned away like everything else the Legion touched. But Caesar himself, even in victory, would face a reckoning. If he'd survived the surgery, he'd live to see his triumph. But the tumor would have taught him something he'd spent decades denying. He was mortal, his body could fail, and the Legion, built entirely around his personality, his vision, his authority, would face an inevitable succession crisis. Lanius was loyal but lacked vision. He could conquer but not govern. He could inspire fear but not the kind of devotion that Caesar commanded. If Caesar died and Lanius took control, the Legion would become even more brutal, even more focused on pure military conquest. The philosophical underpinnings, the dialectic that justified everything, would fade away, leaving only violence. Volp's Inculta offered a different possibility. Cunning, intelligent, pragmatic, he understood that the Legion needed more than just military might to sustain an empire, but he lacked the martial authority that legionaries respected. A power struggle between Lanius and Volps could tear the Legion apart from within. And in victory, Caesar would have to grapple with a problem he'd always dismissed: governance. The Legion excelled at destruction, at conquest, at breaking things. But building, creating, maintaining complex systems over time, they had no experience with any of it. Taking Vegas was one thing, actually running it as the capital of a new civilization was entirely different. The synthesis Caesar envisioned, the new civilization born from the clash of Legion and NCR, required incorporating elements from both, but the Legion's rigid ideology resisted adaptation. They defined themselves in opposition to everything the NCR represented. How could they adopt NCR practices without undermining their own identity? Caesar might have the vision to navigate these contradictions, but his successors almost certainly wouldn't. The legion's victory could plant the seeds of its own eventual collapse. If the NCR won, if they held the dam against the legion's assault, the outcome would be different but no less complicated. The Mojave would remain under NCR authority, bringing both the benefits and problems of their democratic system. The immediate aftermath would be brutal either way. NCR soldiers, exhausted and traumatized by the battle, would not be gentle with defeated legionaries. Caesar's forces would be hunted down, killed or captured. Crucifixions would finally stop, but the memory of legion atrocities would poison relations for years. President Kimball, if he survived assassination attempts, would declare victory and use it to secure his political position back in California. The Mojave campaign, so costly in lives and resources, would be justified by winning Hoover Dam. NCR expansion would continue, bringing their bureaucracy, their corruption, their inefficiency, but also their laws, their freedom, their opportunities. The Mojave's people would have individual rights again, but they'd also face heavy taxation, conscription, the gradual erosion of local autonomy as they were integrated into the NCR's republic. Freeside might improve or might remain a slum, depending on how much the NCR cared about people who couldn't vote or pay taxes. The casinos would operate under NCR regulation, less independent but more stable. Caesar himself, if captured alive, would face a choice that mirrored the one he'd given so many others: death or submission. The NCR would want to execute him publicly, to show that the Legion's god emperor was just a man after all. But they might also see value in keeping him alive, using him as a symbol of their victory, perhaps even trying to rehabilitate him. More likely, Caesar would die, either killed in battle, executed after capture, or finally succumbing to the tumor that had been slowly killing him all along. And with his death, the Legion would fragment. Some legionaries would fight on, becoming raiders and terrorists, refusing to accept defeat. Others would simply vanish into the wasteland, trying to forget they'd ever followed the bull. The tribes that the Legion had conquered, the cultures they'd supposedly erased, might begin to resurface. People would remember their old languages, their traditions, their identities. The Legion's cultural genocide would prove incomplete, and the wasteland's diversity would slowly reassert itself. But if neither the Legion nor the NCR won, if the Courier had accumulated enough power to drive both armies away, then the Mojave's future became truly uncertain. House's vision of technological progress, free from both Legion savagery and NCR bureaucracy, might take hold, or an independent Vegas might chart its own course, a city-state built on individual choice rather than imposed order. The Securitrons, upgraded with the Platinum chip, could maintain security without the oppression of the Legion or the corruption of the Legion or the corruption of the NCR. The casinos would operate freely, generating wealth that could rebuild the Mojave. The followers could help people without interference. The kings could maintain their culture and freeside. Every settlement could determine its own path. But independence meant responsibility. Without a larger power to provide protection, to settle disputes, to enforce standards, the Mojave might descend into chaos. Raiders could return. Factions could war among themselves. The freedom that independence brought could become the freedom to destroy each other. And there was the question of what came next. Beyond the battle, beyond the immediate aftermath, the wasteland was larger than the Mojave, larger than the conflict between Legion and NCR. To the east, the Legion's heartland in Arizona still existed. Tribes still lived under Caesar's brutal peace. To the west, California sprawled with all its problems and potential. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam wasn't an ending. It was a pivot point, a moment when the wasteland's future hung in balance. Whatever happened there would ripple outward, affecting communities that had never heard of Caesar or the NCR, shaping the world that future generations would inherit. In the end, the greatest irony might have been that Caesar was both right and wrong. History was shaped by vast forces, by the clash of ideologies and civilizations, but it was also shaped by individual choices, by the decisions of people who refused to be swept along by historical inevitability. The Courier, shot in the head and left for dead, had proven that one person could change everything, that individual agency mattered as much as historical forces, that the future wasn't predetermined by dialectics or destiny, but forged through countless small choices that accumulated into massive change. Caesar had tried to build a civilization on absolute principles, on the rejection of everything that had failed before, but the wasteland didn't work that way. Survival required adaptation, compromise, the willingness to learn from both success and failure. The Legion's rigid ideology, for all its short-term effectiveness, contained the seeds of its own limitation. Whatever the outcome of the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, one truth remained constant: the wasteland would endure. It had survived nuclear fire, had persisted through centuries of chaos, had continued despite every attempt to control or destroy it. Caesar's Legion was just another chapter in its long, violent history. And like every chapter before it, this one too would end, giving way to whatever came next. The story of Caesar's Legion raises questions that echo far beyond the Mojave wasteland, questions about civilization itself and what we're willing to sacrifice for it. Edward Sallow began as an idealist, a scholar who genuinely believed education and compassion could heal the post-apocalyptic world. The followers of the apocalypse weren't naive dreamers. They understood the wasteland's brutality, but they believed humanity could rise above it through knowledge and cooperation. They sent Sallow to help people, to lift them from tribal warfare into something better. And in a way, he did exactly that. The 87 tribes that Caesar conquered were trapped in cycles of violence that would have continued forever without outside intervention. Blood feuds, generations old, dictated their actions. Young men died for causes they barely understood. Resources were wasted on pointless conflicts. The tribes were, objectively, going nowhere. Caesar ended that. He brought peace, of a sort. The Legion's territories didn't suffer from the constant raiding that plagued other parts of the wasteland. Trade routes were secure. A person traveling through Legion land was safer from random violence than almost anywhere else in post-nuclear America. That counts for something in a world where safety is the rarest commodity. But the price was everything that made those tribes unique. Their languages, their stories, their ways of understanding the world, all erased. The people survived, but as shells of what they'd been, molded into Caesar's vision with no room for deviation. Is that salvation or annihilation? The answer depends on what you value more, physical survival or cultural identity. Caesar would argue they were the same question viewed from different angles. Culture, in his philosophy, was a luxury that required stability. You needed peace before you could have art, security before you could preserve traditions. The Legion provided that foundation, harsh as it was. Future generations, he believed, would build something new on the bedrock of order he'd created. But history suggests otherwise. Every empire built on pure conquest eventually collapses. Rome itself, the model Caesar tried to recreate, fell to internal decay and external pressure. The Mongols, who conquered more territory than anyone before or since, fragmented within generations of Genghis Khan's death. The Legion, built entirely around one man's vision, faced the same inevitable decline. And there's the deeper question of whether Caesar's methods could ever produce the synthesis he envisioned. His dialectic assumed that clashing with the NCR would create something better than either, but dialectics require genuine engagement, not just destruction. Thesis and antithesis must truly interact, must influence each other for synthesis to emerge. The Legion didn't engage with the NCR, it sought to destroy them. Caesar rejected everything about democracy, individual freedom, technological progress. He didn't want to learn from his enemy, only to conquer them. That's not dialectical evolution, that's just substituting one absolute system for another. The real tragedy might be that Caesar's brilliance was wasted on the wrong solution. His analysis of the wasteland's problems was often accurate. Tribal warfare was self-destructive. NCR democracy was corrupt and inefficient. The old world's mistakes were being repeated. These were legitimate observations. But his solution, total autocracy backed by slavery and cultural genocide, was worse than the problems it claimed to solve. A brilliant mind, twisted by circumstance and ancient texts, created something monstrous while believing he was saving humanity. The transformation from Edward Sallow to Caesar reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. We like to think we'd resist becoming monsters, that our principles would hold against pressure. But Sallow's principles did hold in a way. He never stopped believing in civilization, in order, in building something better. He just redefined what those words meant until they justified atrocity. That's more frightening than simple corruption. Caesar wasn't motivated by greed or power lust, at least not entirely. He genuinely believed in his vision. He saw himself as a necessary evil, a harsh medicine that would cure the wasteland's sickness. The road to hell, paved with good intentions, leads through philosophical justification. And the wasteland, being the wasteland, couldn't offer a clear moral verdict. In some ways, the Legion worked. It achieved objectives that seemed impossible. It created order from chaos, strength from weakness, unity from division. Legionaries were healthier than many wastelanders, better fed, more disciplined. The territories under Legion control had less random violence than NCR lands. But they also had no freedom, no choice, no individual worth beyond service to the state. Women were property, slaves were worked to death. Any deviation from absolute loyalty meant crucifixion. The order came at the cost of everything that made life worth living. The NCR offered an alternative, but not a perfect one. Democracy in the wasteland was messy, corrupt, frustratingly slow. Individual freedom meant people could make bad choices, could exploit each other, could fail. Bureaucracy meant that help often arrived too late, or not at all. The NCR protected individual rights, but couldn't always protect individuals. Yet it allowed for growth, for change, for the possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. People under NCR rule could dream of improving their situation, could work toward goals they chose for themselves. The system's flaws were visible because people could complain about them, could organize to demand change. It wasn't efficient, but it was human. Caesar's Legion and the NCR represented more than just two armies fighting over a dam. They represented different answers to the fundamental question of post-apocalyptic existence. How do you rebuild civilization from the ashes? Do you impose order from above, sacrificing freedom for security? Or do you embrace the chaos of democracy, accepting inefficiency as the price of liberty? The Mojave became the testing ground for these philosophies, and the results were written in blood on both sides. Thousands died so that one vision or the other could prevail, or so that both could be rejected in favor of something else entirely. But perhaps the most important legacy of Caesar's Legion isn't about which system won. It's about what the conflict revealed, that the wasteland had moved beyond simple survival, beyond just scraping by day to day. People were thinking about the future again, about what kind of world they wanted to build. The Legion, for all its faults, proved that large-scale organization was possible, that tribes could be united, that order could be imposed, that the wasteland wasn't doomed to eternal fragmentation. Even those who hated everything Caesar stood for had to acknowledge he'd achieved something remarkable. And the NCR proved that democracy could survive nuclear fire, that people could govern themselves even in the harshest conditions. That individual freedom wasn't just a pre-war luxury. Both sides pushed each other, forced each other to be better, to adapt, to evolve. That might be the true dialectic, not the synthesis Caesar imagined, but the ongoing tension between order and freedom, security and liberty, the collective and the individual. Maybe the wasteland needed both impulses, needed to constantly balance between them, to find stability without stagnation, freedom without chaos. The individuals caught in this grand historical struggle each had to make their own choices. Legionaries who believed in Caesar's vision versus those who followed from fear. NCR soldiers fighting for their republic versus those just following orders. Mojave residents choosing sides or trying to survive regardless of who won. And the Courier, representing pure individual agency, proving that one person could still matter despite the weight of history. In the end, Caesar's legacy would be measured not by whether he won or lost, but by what his existence meant for the wasteland's future. He'd shown that the old world's philosophies could be adapted, for better or worse. He'd proven that charisma and vision could reshape entire societies. He'd demonstrated both the potential and the danger of absolute conviction. The wasteland would remember Caesar, though how they remembered him would depend on who was telling the story. A visionary who tried to save humanity through harsh necessity. A monster who built an empire on slavery and genocide. A brilliant man driven mad by wasteland realities. A cautionary tale about the dangers of ideological purity. All of these, perhaps. History is rarely simple, and the Wasteland's history was written in radiation and blood, leaving nothing simple or clean. Caesar's legion was neither purely evil nor purely good, neither completely right nor completely wrong. It was human, which meant it was complicated, contradictory, capable of both remarkable achievement and terrible atrocity. And that legacy, complex and troubling, would haunt the Wasteland long after the battles were over. To understand Caesar's legion, we must confront an uncomfortable truth about the Wasteland and about ourselves. The post-apocalyptic world stripped away the comfortable illusions that civilization had built over millennia. In the old world, people could pretend that violence was an aberration, that cruelty was the exception, that humanity was fundamentally good beneath a thin veneer of chaos. The nuclear fire burned away those pretenses, leaving only the raw truth. And the truth, as the Wasteland revealed it, was that humans are capable of absolutely anything. Given the right circumstances, the right pressures, the right justifications, we can become saints or monsters, builders or destroyers, saviors or tyrants. Edward Sallow proved this more clearly than perhaps anyone else in the post-nuclear age. He wasn't born evil. He wasn't corrupted by some external force of darkness. He simply looked at the world around him, applied his considerable intelligence to the problem of wasteland survival, and concluded that brutality was the only rational response. And the horrifying part is that his logic wasn't entirely wrong. The tribes were trapped in self-destructive cycles. Democracy had failed so catastrophically that it had ended civilization itself. Technology had given humanity the power to destroy the world, and humanity had eagerly pulled the trigger. Every system the old world had tried had led to nuclear holocaust. Why would any of them work in the Wasteland? Caesar's answer was to reject modernity entirely, to reach back to the ancient world for solutions. Rome had built an empire that lasted centuries. Rome had brought peace to warring peoples, had created stability through strength, had achieved something that endured. Why not learn from their success instead of repeating recent failures? The flaw in this reasoning, the fatal mistake that doomed Caesar's vision from the start, was his selective reading of history. He saw Rome's conquests and missed its evolution. The Roman Republic became an empire, yes, but it also developed law, philosophy, engineering, art, culture. It wasn't just military might. It was a genuine civilization that created as much as it destroyed. Caesar's legion created nothing. It only consumed, only destroyed, only erased. And in that fundamental emptiness lay its ultimate failure, regardless of whether it won battles or controlled territory. You can't build a lasting civilization on pure negation, on the systematic destruction of everything that came before. But here's what makes Caesar's story particularly tragic, and particularly relevant to understanding the Wasteland. He was trying to solve a real problem. The question of how to rebuild civilization after total collapse isn't academic. It's the central challenge facing every community in post-nuclear America. Do you preserve the old ways, even though they led to destruction? Do you try something completely new, even without knowing if it will work? Do you impose order by force, or allow chaos in hope that freedom will eventually produce stability? These aren't simple questions with obvious answers. The Mojave became a laboratory for testing different approaches. The NCR represented continuity with the old world, attempting to recreate pre-war democracy despite its obvious flaws. They believed that the system could work if implemented properly, that the mistakes of the past could be avoided through better leadership and more careful governance. Caesar's legion represented radical rejection of the old world, an attempt to start fresh with ancient models. They believed the old world's failure was total, that nothing from it was worth preserving, that only a complete break with recent history could save humanity. Mr. House represented a third option, technological autocracy guided by someone who'd actually seen the old world and learned from its mistakes. He believed that properly applied technology and centralized control could create prosperity without the chaos of democracy or the brutality of the legion. And the possibility of an independent Mojave represented yet another path, the idea that maybe large-scale systems themselves were the problem, that maybe communities needed to be free to find their own solutions, rather than having answers imposed from above. Each approach had merit, each had fatal flaws, and the wasteland, being what it was, couldn't afford the luxury of philosophical debates. People were dying, communities were suffering, decisions had to be made with incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. Caesar made his decision with absolute conviction. He saw the tribal warfare, saw the NCR's corruption, saw the wasteland's suffering, and concluded that only total transformation could fix it. He committed completely to his vision, refusing to compromise, refusing to doubt, refusing to consider that he might be wrong. That absolute certainty is what made him dangerous, not the specific beliefs he held, but his unwillingness to question them. A leader who doubts can be reasoned with, can adapt, can change course when evidence demands it. Caesar couldn't. His entire identity, his entire purpose, rested on being right. Admitting error would mean admitting that everything he'd built was founded on a mistake. So he doubled down. Every atrocity was justified as necessary. Every cultural genocide was framed as liberation. Every act of slavery was presented as giving purpose to the purposeless. The philosophy bent to accommodate the actions, rather than actions changing to match the philosophy. This is how good intentions curdle into horror. Not through sudden corruption, but through gradual justification. Through the slow accumulation of compromises with conscience. Through the belief that the end justifies any means. Caesar's path from idealistic teacher to brutal warlord was paved with logical steps, each one defensible in isolation, each one leading inevitably to the next. And the wasteland offered no clear rebuttal. The legion worked in its way. It achieved results. It brought order to chaos, strength to weakness, unity to division. Legionaries were fed, clothed, given purpose. The territories they controlled were safer than most. If you measured success purely by survival and stability, ignoring the human cost, the legion succeeded where others failed. But survival and stability aren't enough. They're necessary, but not sufficient. A civilization needs more than just continued existence. It needs meaning, beauty, growth, the possibility of becoming something better. It needs to value human life as more than just fuel for the machine. The NCR understood this, even if they often failed to live up to it. Their system was flawed, corrupt, inefficient, but it at least acknowledged that individuals mattered, that people had inherent worth beyond their utility to the state. It was messy because humans are messy, complicated because life is complicated. Caesar tried to eliminate that messiness, to reduce humanity to simple components in a grand machine, but humans resist simplification. We're contradictory, irrational, beautifully complex, in ways that no system can fully contain. The Legion's attempt to strip away that complexity didn't create superior humans. It created broken ones, people molded into shapes that served Caesar's vision but denied their own nature. The question that haunted the Mojave, the question that every wastelander had to answer for themselves, was whether Caesar's brutal efficiency was worth the cost in human dignity. Was it better to live as a slave in safety, or die free in chaos? Was survival under oppression preferable to freedom with risk? Different people gave different answers. Some joined the Legion willingly, believing in Caesar's vision, or simply calculating that backing the stronger side was smart. Others fought to the death rather than submit, valuing freedom above life itself. Most fell somewhere in between, trying to survive while preserving as much of themselves as possible. And through it all, the wasteland kept its own counsel. It had seen civilizations rise and fall before. It had watched humanity destroy itself and try to rebuild. It had witnessed every ideology, every system, every attempt to impose meaning on a world that seemed designed to resist it. The wasteland didn't care about Caesar's dialectic or the NCR's democracy or House's calculations. It simply was, indifferent to human struggles, providing the stage on which these dramas played out but never favoring any particular outcome. That indifference, that fundamental neutrality of the wasteland itself, might be the most important lesson of all. There is no destiny, no historical inevitability, no guaranteed outcome. The future isn't predetermined by grand theories or ancient precedents. It's created by choices, by actions, by people deciding what they're willing to fight for and what they're willing to sacrifice. Caesar believed he could control that future, could shape it according to his vision. But the Courier proved him wrong. One person with no army, no philosophy, no grand plan could change everything simply by refusing to accept that the future was already written. In the end, maybe that's what Caesar's story teaches us. Not about the right way to rebuild civilization, but about the danger of believing you found it. Not about whether democracy or autocracy is superior, but about the importance of remaining open to doubt, to change, to the possibility that you might be wrong. The Wasteland doesn't need perfect solutions. It needs people willing to try, to fail, to learn, to try again. It needs the messy, complicated, frustratingly human process of figuring things out as we go. Caesar's certainty, his absolute conviction that he alone understood the path forward, was his greatest weakness. And perhaps in recognizing that weakness, the Wasteland could find its strength. The story of Caesar's legion is, in many ways, a story the Wasteland has told before and will tell again. Long before Edward Sallow found those books in the Grand Canyon, long before the nuclear fire consumed the old world, humanity had been asking the same questions and making the same mistakes. The cycle of civilization rising and falling, of order giving way to chaos, giving way to new order, stretched back to the beginning of recorded history. Ancient empires conquered their neighbors in the name of peace. Medieval kingdoms waged holy wars for God and glory. Modern nations drafted millions to fight for democracy or communism or nationalism. The justifications changed, the technologies evolved, but the fundamental pattern remained constant. Those with power sought more. Those without struggled to survive, and caught between them, ordinary people paid the price. The Great War that ended the old world was just the latest iteration of this eternal pattern. America and China, locked in a struggle for resources and dominance, chose mutual annihilation over compromise. They had the most advanced weapons ever created, the most sophisticated systems of governance, access to all of human knowledge and history, and they used it all to destroy everything. Caesar understood this. He'd studied history extensively, seen the pattern repeat across cultures and centuries. That's what led him to his philosophy, his belief that humanity needed to break the cycle by reaching back before modern civilization, before the systems that had failed so catastrophically. But in trying to break the cycle, Caesar only perpetuated it. The legion was new in its specifics, but ancient in its essence. Conquest, slavery, cultural destruction, the subordination of individual will to state power, all of it had been done before, countless times by countless civilizations. Rome, Mongolia, the caliphates, the colonial empires, all had walked this path, and all had eventually fallen. The NCR made the opposite mistake. They tried to recreate the old world's democracy, believing that the system itself wasn't flawed, just its implementation. If they could just get it right this time, if they could avoid the corruption and excess that had doomed pre-war America, then democracy could work in the Wasteland. But they were discovering what every democracy before them had learned. The system required constant vigilance, constant effort, constant resistance to the forces that would corrupt it. And in the Wasteland, where survival was already a full-time job, maintaining democratic ideals was nearly impossible. Slowly, inevitably, the same problems emerged. Corruption, bureaucracy, the wealthy manipulating the system, the poor getting left behind. War never changes because people never change. Why make the same choices, fall into the same traps, justify the same atrocities with new language but identical logic? The Wasteland, stripped of civilization's comfortable lies, revealed this truth more clearly than the old world ever could. Caesar saw it and tried to embrace it, to build a system that acknowledged humanity's violent nature and channeled it toward productive ends. But violence isn't productive, it's just violence. The legion's strength came from destruction, and when there was nothing left to destroy, what would remain? The NCR saw it and tried to resist it, to prove that humanity could be better than its worst impulses. But resistance required sacrifice, and in the Wasteland people had so little left to sacrifice. When choosing between principles and survival, survival usually won. Mr. House saw it, and tried to transcend it, to use technology and planning to guide humanity away from its self-destructive patterns. But humans resist being guided, resist plans made for them, rather than by them. Control, even benevolent control, breeds resentment and rebellion. And the Wasteland itself, the Great Leveler, demonstrated the futility of all these approaches. It had watched the old world fall. It had seen countless attempts to rebuild. It knew that every system, every philosophy, every grand vision eventually crumbled under the weight of human nature and harsh reality. Yet people kept trying. That was the paradox, the contradiction at the heart of post-apocalyptic existence. Knowing that everything eventually failed, people still built, still hoped, still believed that maybe this time would be different. The Courier embodied this contradiction perfectly. They'd been killed, or nearly so, shot in the head and buried in a shallow grave. By all rights, their story should have ended there. Another victim of wasteland violence, forgotten before the dirt settled. But they got back up. They kept going. They changed the course of history through sheer stubborn refusal to accept that their story was over. That persistence, that refusal to give up even when giving up made perfect sense, might be humanity's greatest strength and greatest flaw. It led to remarkable achievements, to civilization rising from ashes, to people finding beauty and meaning in the harshest conditions. But it also led to repeating mistakes, to wars that could have been avoided, to suffering that served no purpose. Caesar's legion was born from that same persistence, that same refusal to accept the wasteland as it was. Edward Sallow could have remained a teacher, could have continued the followers' patient work of education and healing. Instead, he decided to reshape the entire wasteland according to his vision. Consequences be damned. That ambition, that scope, that willingness to pay any price for his goals marked him as both exceptional and terrible. He wasn't content with small improvements or gradual change. He wanted total transformation, immediate and absolute, and he nearly achieved it. The tragedy was that his transformation came at such horrific cost. 87 cultures erased, thousands enslaved, countless dead, all in service of a vision that, even if realized, would likely have collapsed within generations of his death. The cult of personality that held the legion together was its structural weakness, ensuring that Caesar's empire could never outlast Caesar himself. But perhaps that's true of all empires, all grand visions, all attempts to impose order on chaos. They work for a while, achieve temporary stability, create the illusion of permanence. Then the founder dies, or the external pressures become too great, or internal contradictions tear the structure apart, and everything falls back into chaos. The cycle continues. Order to chaos, chaos to order, forever and ever, with humanity caught in the middle, alternately creating and destroying, building and tearing down, hoping and despairing. War never changes, because war is the crucible where these forces meet, where order and chaos clash in their eternal struggle. The specific wars change. The Mojave campaign was different from the Great War, different from Rome's conquests, different from every conflict that came before. But the fundamental nature of war, of organized violence in service of political goals, remained constant. Caesar quoted this himself, used it to justify his actions. If war never changes, if violence is eternal, then why not embrace it? Why not use it as a tool to build something lasting? The legion was his answer, violence systematized and directed toward what he believed was a greater good. But the quote has a second meaning. One Caesar might have missed. War never changes, but people can. Individuals, communities, civilizations, they all have the capacity to learn, to grow, to choose different paths. The pattern repeats because we let it, because we make the same choices our ancestors made. Breaking the cycle doesn't require rejecting modernity or embracing ancient solutions. It requires recognizing our own capacity for both creation and destruction, and consciously choosing creation even when destruction seems easier. The Mojave Wasteland became a test of that choice. Would humanity repeat the patterns that led to nuclear holocaust? Would the Legion's conquest or the NCR's expansion or House's control or independent chaos prove to be just another variation on the same theme? Or could something genuinely new emerge, some synthesis not of political systems but of wisdom and compassion? The answer, as with everything in the Wasteland, depended on individuals making choices. Not just the Courier, though their choices mattered most, but every person deciding what they valued, what they'd fight for, what they'd refuse to accept. Caesar made his choice decades earlier. in the depths of the Grand Canyon, when he decided that peace required conquest and civilization required slavery. That choice echoed through the wasteland, affecting thousands of lives, shaping the course of history. But it wasn't the only choice that mattered. Every legionary who followed orders or questioned them, every NCR soldier who fought or fled, every Mojave resident who resisted or submitted, they all contributed to the outcome. History wasn't made by great men alone, despite what Caesar believed. It was made by countless small decisions, accumulating into tides that swept everyone along. And in the end, maybe that's the real lesson of Caesar's legion. Not about political systems or military strategy or philosophical dialectics, but about the weight of our choices and the responsibility we bear for them. Caesar chose to become a conqueror, to build an empire on suffering and death. He could have chosen differently, and that possibility, that freedom to choose, was something no philosophy could eliminate. War never changes, but we can. We can learn from history instead of repeating it. We can choose compassion over cruelty, cooperation over conquest, building over destroying. The wasteland makes those choices harder, strips away the luxury of easy morality, but it doesn't eliminate choice itself. Caesar's story, tragic and terrible as it was, proved that individuals matter, that one person's choices can reshape the world. He used that power to create horror, but the same capacity for impact, for changing the course of history, existed in everyone who heard his story and decided how to respond. The cycle would continue. Wars would be fought. Civilizations would rise and fall. The wasteland would endure. But each iteration offered the possibility of learning, of growing, of maybe, just maybe, breaking the pattern at last. That hope, fragile and precious in the harsh light of post-nuclear reality, was what kept people going. Not certainty of success, but the belief that trying mattered, that choices mattered, that the future wasn't predetermined by the failures of the past. War never changes, but everything else can. Night falls over the Mojave Desert, as it has for millions of years, as it will for millions more. The Colorado River flows quietly past Hoover Dam, that monument to human ambition and engineering. The concrete structure stands silent now, its turbines humming their eternal song regardless of who controls them. Water moves through ancient channels, generating power that lights distant settlements, powers distant dreams, sustains distant lives. On Fortification Hill, where Caesar once stood surveying his future empire, the wind whispers through abandoned fortifications or occupied camps, depending on how the story ended. But either way, the wind cares not. It moves across the hill, down into the valley, carrying dust and memory in equal measure. The Strip glows in the distance, 3 casinos defying the darkness with pre-war neon. From far enough away, you could almost believe the old world never ended, that civilization continued uninterrupted, that the nuclear fire was just a bad dream. But closer inspection reveals the cracks, the patches, the desperate maintenance that keeps the lights burning against the encroaching desert. In Freeside, people settle into whatever shelter they've claimed. Some sleep in actual beds, in homes they've built or claimed or defended. Others curl up in corners, in doorways, in the spaces between. The Kings keep watch, or NCR patrols do, or Legion guards, or no one at all. But somehow people sleep. Even in the wasteland, even after everything, people sleep. The followers of the apocalypse, if they survived, tend to the wounded in the old Mormon fort. Their work continues regardless of political outcomes, regardless of which army won or lost. Pain doesn't care about politics, and healing transcends ideology. They wash wounds, distribute medicine, offer what comfort they can in a world that offers so little. Out in the desert, beyond the settlements and the struggles, the night creatures emerge. Geckos chirp their strange calls. Coyotes howl at stars that have witnessed everything and judge nothing. The wasteland's ecosystem, adapted to radiation and ruin, continues its ancient rhythms. Life persists, strange as it's become, stubborn as it's always been. The graves are quiet now, the ones at Good Springs where the Courier was buried and somehow survived. The mass graves from both battles at Hoover Dam, where thousands who won't survive rest beneath hastily piled earth. The crucifixes that line Legion roads, monuments to terror and control, eventually reclaimed by weather and time. Caesar himself, alive or dead, has become something more than a man. He's a symbol now, a story the Wasteland will tell for generations. Some will speak his name with reverence, others with hatred, most with a complicated mixture of both. But they'll speak it, remember it, argue about what it meant and what it means. The burned man, Joshua Graham, lives on in Zion Canyon, or in legend depending on the path the story took. His survival, against all odds, became its own kind of myth. The Malpais Legi, who rose from the Grand Canyon, scarred and transformed, a walking reminder that nothing in the Wasteland stays buried forever. Lanius, the monster of the East, commands the Legion or lies dead among the fallen, but his legacy of calculated brutality shaped warfare across the Wasteland. He proved that terror could be a strategy, that reputation could be a weapon, that sometimes the cruelest path led to victory. Volps Incolta, master of shadows and secrets, continues his work in darkness or fades into obscurity. The Frumentari network he built will outlast any individual leader, a web of spies and agents that proved information could be as valuable as armies. The NCR soldiers, whether victorious or defeated, scattered to their homes or graves, carry their own stories. Young people who came to the Mojave believing in democracy, in civilization, in their republic's manifest destiny, learned that reality was more complicated than patriotic speeches suggested. Some lost faith, some found it, most just survived and tried to make sense of what they'd experienced. And the Courier, the wild card who changed everything, walks their own path through the Wasteland, perhaps ruling from the Lucky 38, perhaps wandering to new adventures, perhaps settling into quiet obscurity. But their legend grows with each telling, the person who survived the impossible and shaped the Mojave's destiny through individual choice. The Wasteland itself endures, as it always has, as it always will. The radiation slowly fades, measured in half-lives that span centuries. Plants adapt, animals evolve, the desert reclaims what humanity briefly claimed from it. In 1,000 years, maybe the scars will heal, maybe new civilizations will rise, having learned from the old ones' mistakes, maybe not. But tonight, in this moment, the Mojave rests. The battles are over, the choices made, the consequences set in motion. Tomorrow will bring new struggles, new choices, new consequences. But tomorrow is not yet here. The stars above shine with the same light they cast on ancient Rome, on pre-war America, on the nuclear holocaust, on Caesar's rise and fall. They shine on the Wasteland without judgment, without mercy, without care. They simply are, constant in their distant fire, indifferent to human drama. Somewhere, a child born after the Second Battle of Hoover Dam sleeps peacefully, unaware of the forces that shaped the world they inherited. They'll grow up in whatever society emerged from the conflict, learning its values, accepting its truths, questioning its lies. They'll face their own choices, make their own mistakes, contribute to the next chapter of the Wasteland's endless story. The wind picks up slightly, carrying the scent of creosote and sage, the distinctive smell of the Mojave night. It's peaceful in a way that the day rarely is, when the harsh sun relents and the desert breathes and life slows to a gentler rhythm. Caesar's legion, the NCR, Mr. House, all the grand forces and philosophies and struggles, they fade into the background. What remains is simpler, more fundamental. People trying to survive, to find meaning, to build something in the ruins. It's not glorious or philosophical or historically significant. It's just human. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the grand visions and absolute certainties and dialectical syntheses were always missing the point. Maybe civilization isn't built by conquering empires or democratic republics or technological autocracies. Maybe it's built by ordinary people making ordinary choices, day after day, trying to be decent in a world that makes decency difficult. The Mojave sleeps, but it dreams. Dreams of water flowing freely, of lights that never dim, of peace that doesn't require slavery, of freedom that doesn't collapse into chaos. Dreams of tomorrow, always tomorrow. That day when things might finally be better. Those dreams might be illusions. The Wasteland has a way of crushing hope, of revealing the harsh truth beneath comfortable fantasies. But dreams persist anyway, stubborn as the people who dream them, refusing to die even when death seems certain. As the night deepens, the temperature drops. The desert that burned under the day's sun now chills. People pull blankets tighter, huddle closer together, share warmth in a cold world. It's a small thing, sharing warmth, but small things matter when you have so little. The story of Caesar's legion is over, or perhaps it's just beginning, depending on what happened at Hoover Dam and what comes next. But either way, this chapter closes. The Wasteland turns its attention to other matters, other stories, other struggles. Life goes on because it always does, because it must, because stopping means death. Somewhere in the darkness, someone tends a fire, keeping the flames alive against the night. It's a scene repeated across the wasteland, across human history, the simple act of maintaining light against encroaching darkness. Perhaps that's what we do, what we've always done, what we'll always do. Keep the fires burning, tell the stories, remember the lessons, and hope that tomorrow's light reveals a path forward. The Mojave Desert, ancient and eternal, settles into its nightly rest. The battles are history now. The blood has been shed. The choices have been made. What comes next is uncertain, as it's always been, as it always will be. But for now, in this quiet moment between what was and what will be, the wasteland sleeps. And in that sleep, perhaps, there is peace. The story is told. The legions rise and fall, Caesar's transformation from teacher to tyrant, the clash of civilizations in the Mojave, all of it part of the wasteland's endless tapestry. Those who lived it carry the memories, the scars, the lessons learned. Those who come after will inherit the consequences, for better or worse. The Colorado River keeps flowing, the stars keep shining, the wasteland keeps enduring, and somewhere, someone makes a choice that will ripple forward into the future, adding another thread to the story that never truly ends. Rest now, wanderer. The tale is told, the journey complete. Tomorrow brings new roads to walk, new stories to discover, new choices to make. But tonight, let the Mojave's peace settle over you, like dust from the desert wind. The Legion marched, the NCR fought, the Courier chose, and the Wasteland, as it always does, survive to see another day. Sleep well, the dawn when it comes will bring whatever it brings. Until then, there is only the quiet darkness, the cooling sand, the distant howl of coyotes, and the eternal desert breathing softly beneath the stars. The story of Caesar's legion, complete in its tragedy and complexity, becomes one more legend in a wasteland full of them, and legends like the desert itself endure. Good night, Mojave. Rest easy, wasteland, until we meet again.